So I'm going to be talking today about the book, The Citizen's Share, Reducing Inequality in the 21st Century, that I wrote together with my colleague Richard Freeman from the Economics Department at Harvard and Douglas Cruz from the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers. In one sentence, this book is a 250-year history of the capital share idea in American history and of policy on this subject, and it ends with 10 policies to make capital shares a significant part of social and economic policy. So my wife says, well, if you could summarize the book in 30 seconds, then what is the other 300 pages trying to do? Well, that's not a bad comment. So obviously, why care about this? Why care about this subject? These are recent wealth statistics which update Thomas Piketty's book done by Sayers and Zuckman, and they're interesting because it's been really hard to measure wealth concentration, and what Sayers and Zuckman have done is look at the capital income that individuals report, and then walk the cat back to figure out what is the capital ownership, the wealth that income was thrown off by. So they've come up with, I think, better statistics, updated statistics. Piketty's book was based on the Survey of Consumer Finance, at least for the United States, and unfortunately, higher concentration numbers. So you can see that just looking at wealth or a capital, and the top is concentration, the top 0.01%, 0.1%, 1%, 10%. And you can see the numbers between 1979 and 2012 have gone up really quite significantly. The top 10% holding about 77% of all capital ownership, compared to 23% for the bottom 90%. Capital income, which are the capital gains, dividends, interest, and related incomes on this capital, have gone up far more rapidly. In fact, the top 10% having 97% concentration of capital income. This is just stunning. Just to be clear, at the time of the American Revolution, the top 400 families in England owned about 80% of the land. So we are at feudal, F-E-U-D-A-L, and maybe futile proportions here. It's really quite stunning. To say that this type of growth may not be sustainable is probably a huge understatement. And you can see when you take the top 10% income share, including and excluding capital gains, you can see what the addition of capital income, what capital gains does to the numbers. It lifts them up by about 4 or 5%. So why care? Labor income as a percent of national income has also declined. Inflation-adjusted wages are flat and going down at the same time. The productivity wage gap is widening. And beyond this, the numbers on labor income appear to be false or understated. Why? Because here in the United States, the government includes in labor income, right, executive compensation grants of stock and profit sharing and gain sharing in the 5,000 publicly traded companies on the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ. So if you back that out of labor income, then labor income would even be dropping more. So part of this is an issue that we measure things to benefit the systems and the establishment's perspective on things. It understates the concentration. Just like the Fed's Survey of Consumer Finance has understated the concentration, Sayers and Zuckman have tried to fix that. We've not had this fix on labor income. So it's all worse than we think. Most increased income growth has gone to the top. So from the Economic Policy Institute under President Clinton, the top 1% received 45% of income growth. Under President Bush, George W. Bush, the top received 57%. Yes, that is a difference, and partisans make hay about that difference. I'd like to say how close the numbers are for the moment. We can look at flat wages from the Economic Policy Institute, State of Work in America, and you can also see college graduates not really getting that return on skills that one would have hoped for. This talk will cover studying capital shares, the incidence of capital shares, the history of capital shares, research on capital shares, and capital share policy options. I'm going to move more quickly through the first part because I would like to dwell on policy. One part of my biography that Maury didn't mention is that when I was a young lecturer here in social studies at Harvard, where I was a lecturer for 10 years, I also served as a legislative assistant in the House of Representatives for 5 years. So I actually have a lot of training on policy, on scoring legislation, on what to amend, on section this and section that, on reading the budget. So it's one of the craft skills I happen to pick up and have kept up with it. And this book largely reflects that additional carpentry skill. So studying capital shares. The view of the book can be summarized in this way. If the concentration of capital ownership and capital income are central to inequality, why not simply explore broadening both directly in the population rather than working on secondary and tertiary approaches? Now, I do want to say that there are many questions and many controversies and many issues that come up if you accept this hypothesis. But let's for the moment say that this hypothesis might be at least a good part of the inequality solution discussion. Now, in the United States, broad-based share mechanisms today involve worker equity ownership. You've heard of these terms. ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans, are one, probably the most common. ESOPs are widely misunderstood. ESOPs are a form of worker ownership. It's very important, where the worker does not buy the shares. Okay? They are financed worker ownership, invented by investment banker, law professor, and political economist Louis Kelso. They involve a company setting up a worker trust. The trust, just like a mortgagee, borrows money. The company, not the worker saving, the company value, not the worker savings, are collateral. And then the loan is paid back over time by the company from its revenues. And then as the loan is paid back, the profits, the shares are distributed to the workers. With very few exceptions, let me be clear, ESOPs are based on grants of finance shares to workers, not on worker purchase of the shares. This will come up many times in my talk. This is in deep contrast to the type of worker ownership that the Rockefeller family invented in the 20s, which was based largely on workers purchasing the shares. And we also know what happened in 1929 after that was implemented. Although I do have to say that Standard Oil and the Rockefeller family, when they practiced this in their own company, had the most generous, the most liberal, the least risky, and the most beneficial to workers design of it. So it was people who tried to copy and imitate the Rockefellers, who wanted to load more risk on workers, be less generous, less liberal, that created the biggest losses and risks for workers. Then there's profit and gain sharing. Profit sharing, workers receive a cash percent of profit. Gain sharing, they receive a cash percent of gains, very common in the steel industry. And then there's broad-based grants of stock options, which are common, had been common in tech. Restricted stock units, which require that the workers stay. That's the restriction to get the shares. These are grants. And we have also in broad-based share mechanisms, dividend plans such as the Alaska Permanent Fund, which pays a $1,500 dividend to every citizen of Alaska. So $6,000 last year for the average family of 4. Universal basic income I would include here, and other forms of equity and profit sharing. Now, I'll also discuss the issue today, assuming shares are a possible, but not the perfect, response, and they exist, can society make them work, which is really a policy and implementation question. Now, there are some non-epistemological issues which we should not simply sweep aside. What is the meaning of positive outcomes? So for many years, those of us studying these capital share mechanisms in the 70s and 80s were put on the defensive by social scientists, especially the economics profession. You have to show that when you have capital shares in a company that are broad-based, that the company performs better than other companies in the same industry and size and such. And I'm now questioning that. Why does it have to perform better, right? Why can't we reorganize the whole society with broad-based capital shares just as long as it performs as well as the current system? Who set up the design of that question, okay? And so that's the most important epistemological issue. What is the importance of policy on shares in light of the depletion of unions, the fact that the tax system has been largely hijacked by a very small group at the top of society, and the destruction of defined benefit pension plans, and forcing workers to save for their retirement through 401ks, which really shouldn't be called retirement plans if you look at the statistics on 401ks and how concentrated they are. So this is an important epistemological issue, given that there's been so much destruction of these other political economy institutions, unions, broad-based benefits of tax expenditures and pensions. Why should shares have to carry the burden for the destruction of all of these other social supports? Maybe it's too much to ask. Are shares a shell game now or in the future? For example, if we did research and we showed that when Southwest Airlines shares $1 billion in a fiscal year with its workers, that in fact it had cut their wages by $1 billion compared to what would have been fair wages, then that's just wage substitution. Shares are then just a shell game. They're heaping risk on workers. So workers need to receive shares on top of fair fixed wages for them to be a meaningful part of the discussion. Now, I don't want to name the group, but Richard Freeman and I, Doug happened to be sick that day, were in a room just like this of one of the major think tanks on the progressive side in Washington several years ago, presenting one of our policies, 162M, which I'll talk about later. And several leading economists raised their hands, who are progressive leading economists here in Boston, at two very important institutions here in Boston, and said, because there is a perfect, efficient market, that if you granted workers 10% of their total compensation in ESOP shares or in profit sharing, you would have to reduce their fixed wages by 10%. So what this statement was communicating is that, in fact, a capital share policy for economic inequality is impossible according to the laws of economics, right? And if that's true, that this whole discussion, the whole book, all the research, everything is just a fraud. And that's actually what they were saying to us too. So we'll talk a little bit about that.
But it was a nice lunch, right?
It was a lovely lunch, and A neutral group paid for the lunch. But now quickly on the incidence of capital shares. So in 2002, we got foundation support and commissioned the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago to do it every 4-year measure, because that's a nice national representative sample, the General Social Survey, sponsored mostly by the National Science Foundation, of capital shares in the US. So we take the temperature of the economy on these every 4 years. According to the 2014, the most recent one, 19.5% of adult workers say they have some form of worker stock ownership. Okay, 7.2% say they hold company stock options. That's a big number. Remember, there are only 5,000 public companies on the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange, with only 5,000 times 5, 25,000 top 5 executives, SEC named executives. So we have many more, with 7.2% of the American population receiving stock options, many more than those 25,000 executives. 35.8% of adult workers reported that they have some kind of profit sharing, and 26.2% some kind of gain sharing. Now, one of the things that I consistently heard over the decades of work on this is, if this is such a good idea, why isn't everybody doing it? Well, according to 2014 GSS, 44.7% of adult citizens have some form of capital shares. Now, obviously, we don't want to exaggerate. The sums are very, very small. Okay, the median profit or gain share is $1,000. The median employee ownership estate is $2,000. The mean happens to be closer to 10. But if you took sort of the top quartile of these various type of share programs, we actually have significant demonstrations that shares are out there in the U.S. population. But more importantly, and the importance I want to attach to this 44.7% figure is that the mechanisms for capital shares have made it into almost half of the economy. So if you wanted to build a social economic policy on this, corporations know how to do it, small business people know what profit sharing is, these things are known, right? Morgan Stanley, Fidelity manages these plans, their brokerage divisions sell the stock options, the piping is there. There isn't enough water running through the piping, but the piping is there. ESOPs cover about 10,000 firms, 15 million workers, $1 trillion in market value. That's a bit of an exaggeration. That includes publicly traded and closely held companies. The core of the real ESOP world is around 4,000 closely held companies that are mostly 30 to 100% employee-owned. Most of them are 100 or majority employee-owned, and that's a really important demonstration arena. Worker co-ops, which are very important, pure worker co-ops where workers elect the managers and have one worker, one vote, cover around 300 to 400 firms, maybe north of 7,000 workers, and just about $500 million in sales. And we'll talk later about why worker co-ops are not a big part of this. When you talk to academics, their whole idea for solution is worker co-ops everywhere. Worker co-ops have not been able to spread everywhere. I think worker co-ops are a very important part of this discussion. I think this is the moment for worker co-ops in a very important way. But one cannot forget about all of the other capital share approaches. Company stock and 401k plans covers about 9.5 million workers. This is odd. I'll talk about this a lot. How is it that one of the major share plans in the United States, after what happened in 1929, when the workers buying shares with their savings approach caused huge losses to workers and their families, how was it that under the Carter administration, with the 401k law, that this generated, again, is erupted again as being one of the major forms of employee stock ownership, the riskiest form? Outrageous, outrageous. We'll talk about this. In my view, there should be, if we have to kill the bad parts of employee ownership. It should be the 401k, workers buying shares with their savings. Let's just kill it, okay? And have worker ownership, if we have it, only based on grants of stock to workers. I'll say it again, worker ownership only based on grants of stock to workers, profit sharing and gain sharing based on grants of profit sharing and gain sharing to workers, and stock options or restricted stock based on grants of those things to workers, with the very important norm, this is now the summary of our policy idea, that this is above fixed wages. Okay. History of capital shares. If you read anything in the book, I hope you'll read chapter 1. You don't have to buy the book to read it. You can go to our website, www.thecitizenshare.com, and Yale put chapter 1 there for you to read. What we demonstrate is that broad-based property ownership was central to the ideology of many, many of the U.S. founders. And using the very fantastic Rotunda project of the University of Virginia, which now puts online all of the writings of the founders, we did a very, very extensive analysis of a variety of founders who disagreed on a lot of terrible things, who believed that you could not have a representative republic without broad-based property ownership, including Alexander Hamilton, who actually wrote a number of things on this, despite the fact that he was identified with the financial system and such. In fact, we quote him in the book where he said that his plan for manufacturers in the United States presumed that there was a lot of broad-based property ownership so people would have the money to buy the items made by those manufacturers. So yes, he was more focused on the top, but he realized that the top couldn't exist without a broad-based property ownership at the middle and bottom of the system. Now, one of the things we show in the book is that this was not, and I'm not going to dwell on this. If you're interested in it, you can read chapter 1. Certainly there was a lot of hypocrisy to go around, with slave owners talking about broad-based property ownership and how they were reading about democratic republics in Europe that require this, and talking about British philosopher Harrington's views. Here, sitting not far from the State House, it is important to mention to my friends in Massachusetts that when John Adams drafted the Massachusetts Constitution, he was so much talking about James Harrington that several members of the Massachusetts Assembly actually introduced a proposal to change the name of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to Oceana, after Harrington's book, with broad-based property ownership was a very important thing. Had that happened, you would probably have OC before your zip code today. Now, as we talk about in this chapter, these ideas were implemented radically, flawed ethically and practically, obviously, because of the horrible existence of slavery, the terrible evil of slavery, the terrible exclusion of women from civil society, and the fact that the idea of broad-based property ownership was based on land, much of which was taken from Native Americans. Having said this, I do want to illustrate that they very, very quickly did huge policy implementations of this, right? And this is important because any neoconservative or conservative or liberal or neoliberal statement that the founders did not believe in robust policies on broad-based property ownership are totally false, okay? So for example, before they adopted the Constitution, taking the Northwest Territories with the Northwest Ordinance, which has been called the most important legal document of the founders other than the Constitution itself, may not generally be known, they abolished slavery and indentured servitude in this area and made land available very, very cheaply to encourage this broad-based property ownership. Washington, and the book opens with this, Chris and Maury know my wife Nancy. My wife said, please take the story about Washington and profit sharing out of the book. It's a horrible story. The Yale editor said, well, when I read the story about Washington profit sharing, I knew Yale was going to publish the book. so I couldn't really tell my wife about that. But I'll tell the profit sharing story later. But George Washington, in one of his first pieces of business legislation, compelled profit sharing in the cod industry. Cod was the third largest export here in Massachusetts. I don't have to preach to you about cod here in Boston. Jefferson designed a century of low-cost land policies to promote this, using Rawls' term, property-owning republic. When Jefferson became president, he did the Louisiana Purchase, which increased the landmass of the United States, and he said, and this is the name of the famous Oxford American History, this was done to create an empire of liberty, and he specifically said to encourage the property-owning republic to have land to grow with the population. We know of Lincoln's Homestead Act in the way the SBA is an example of this, as are ESOPs. Now, James Madison, after his presidency, sat down at a constitutional convention in the early 1800s in Virginia, and he took out a piece of paper and expected that the population of the United States would grow to X in 100 years, and he expected that the amount of acreage available would be Y in 100 years, and he divided one into the other, and he immediately saw that you couldn't have a property-owning republic. The amount of land per citizen would be too small. And he wrote that there has to be some other way to solve this problem, and that this was the most significant policy problem of the Republic in his view. Now fast forward the tape to someone who you may not have heard of, Galusha Grow. You saw him in the famous movie about President Abraham Lincoln. He's the Speaker of the House of Representatives who managed the Homestead Act through the Congress for Lincoln. After the Homestead Act passed, Grow echoed Madison's statement. And he said, you know, we basically have run out of land. The only way to have a property-owning republic, I'm just paraphrasing, is to give capital shares of profit and ownership, because these assets in the corporate form are unlimited. They're not limited like land. And so you'll see in my book, the break between the history part of the book and the current part of the book is that statement by Galusha Grow. One of the things I talk about in the book in chapter 4, we talk about how business and labor leaders invented all these share mechanisms that we're talking about. Many of them were invented really in the 1800s and perfected by Pillsbury, the founder of the Pillsbury Flour, at this time the largest flour mill in the world, and by William Cooper Proctor at Procter & Gamble. One of my most pleasant moments, in fact, it was the only time in my life that a research discovery literally made my eyes tear up. I had been out to Procter & Gamble working in their archives, and the archivist came up to me and said, you know, the company can never figure out how William Cooper Proctor was an undergraduate at Princeton. He drops out just before he's supposed to graduate, I think because of the Ohio floods. He comes back here. His dad and grandfather make him start from the bottom in the Procter & Gamble company making soap. And then 3 or 4 years later, he institutes company-wide profit sharing and then worker ownership and then workers on the board in the early part of the 1900s. Where the heck did he get the idea? Procter & Gamble can't figure it out. So I went into the Princeton University archives. I went to track down every course he took as a young boy. He took a course in political economy that was required at the new Princeton Engineering School. And I found the lecture notes of his professor, Lyman Atwater, who was trained at the Yale Divinity School. And Lyman Atwater said that the solution to the conflict between labor and capital was profit sharing and worker ownership. And the words in William Cooper Proctor's press release when he announced broad-based profit sharing were the same words from his professor's notes. So if you ever think that a professor cannot influence undergraduates, at Procter & Gamble is now about 25% worker-owned over 100 years later, okay? That's just, you know, one course when he was a young boy. Now, the research on capital shares, I'm going to sort of move ahead rather quickly now because I think we're really running out of time. I think what I will do is we'll share these slides with you. I'll just comment on these general areas and then quickly get to policy. The research on capital shares, about 100 studies generally show that worker ownership, profit sharing, gain sharing, grants of stock, when done broadly, are associated with better loyalty, more willingness to work hard, more suggestions, more commitment to the firm. Interestingly enough, as one would hope, most of the research shows in terms of shares, wealth, and income that many of the companies that do broad-based, most of the companies that do broad-based pay fair wages. So that goes against what the economists in Washington said. We actually have a lot of evidence that we have fair fixed wages, that wages even increase, and you have capital shares on top of this. The biggest objection by CEOs, management people, has been shirking. We did a number of studies where we showed that, in fact, anti-shirking behavior, going against the free rider, trying to help the free rider in a company who is shirking when others are receiving shares, that anti-shirking behavior actually increases when you have broad-based share plans. And it increases more when you combine that with teams and a supportive corporate culture, which my colleague Chris Mackin knows about because he invented the research on supportive corporate cultures in worker-owned firms. One of the big issues here has to do with the sociology of tax expenditures, and I'll talk about that when I talk about policy in a moment. Now, for years, Harry Markowitz's Nobel Prize in portfolio theory has been used as the major weapon against at least the worker ownership part of this idea. So I decided to just deal with this frontally, went out to La Jolla, had a big lunch with Harry, and said, does really portfolio theory really say that you shouldn't have worker ownership because workers shouldn't own any part of their firm from which they have their wages and employment? And Harry said, no. What my Nobel Prize and the theory based on my prize says is that if workers have an otherwise fully diversified portfolio, a small but important part of their portfolio could be in worker share ownership. Just as, Harvard may have a diversified portfolio and put 15% of it into private equity and VC investments. It's the same idea. So we have a series of articles, a working paper at MBER, a chapter, article in operations research, co-authored with Harry, where this is dealt with very, very explicitly. And it's one of the reasons why we do not want workers buying shares. We want only grants of shares, because that helps to reduce the risk. All right, let me quickly just go to the policy section and just move ahead. There's a lot that didn't get dealt with here, but let's talk about the policy options. So the most interesting one of our ideas, recently adopted by Secretary Hillary Clinton's campaign, is her profit-sharing tax credit, which I'm happy to have, with Doug Cruz, played a major part in designing. This is a 2-year tax credit where 15% of profits are shared with workers. Profit-sharing credit is capped at 10% on top of wages. We have a reporting element there to be sure that the company has not reduced its wages over recent years to deal with the wage substitution issue. The program will cost $2 billion a year over 10 years, $20 billion. You could go to the Secretary Clinton's website on this. And I think one of the things that has happened in the last 2 decades is that profit sharing has pretty much, intensive profit sharing has disappeared from American business. And this would hopefully get the good citizen companies and then the almost good citizen companies maybe moving in that direction. So what are some of the policies that we'd like to see? We'd like to see a share policy for every business sector. So for example, I'd like to see the carried interest special capital gains tax treatment in private equity only be available to private equity firms that had broad-based profit sharing and gain sharing or used an ESOP in their acquisitions and their spin-off of portfolio companies. We'd like to see profit share, employee stock ownership based only, as I said, on grants, not employee purchases. We'd like to bring back Section 133 of the Internal Revenue Code, which was really quite significant under the first, under President Reagan and the first President Bush, which gave companies which gave stock market companies a tax deduction. A tax deduction for the interest on loans that they used to do leveraged ESOPs to get shares that they granted to their workers. Back at the end of the 80s, this led to an explosion of ESOPs among stock market companies. It was just cut by the first President Bush's White House just for some deficit reduction. It was just a really dumb thing. You remember when Clinton and Gore ran, they talked about the cap of $1 million on executive pay deduction. As that wound its way through the Congress in the early 90s, that led to a proposal, I should say, by both political parties, supported by both political parties, saying that, okay, there will be that $1 million limit on the deduction of executive pay for the top 5 executives in stock market companies, but capital share pay, like gain sharing, profit sharing, grants of stock options for top 5 executives would have, listen, an unlimited deduction, right? If I'm CEO of a company and I want to set up an ESOP, I could get around a $50,000 tax deduction for any of you in my company. But if I am a board member at Oracle and I want to give a $100 million gain share to Larry Ellison, I can deduct the whole damn thing. Okay? That is just wrong. Okay? That is just wrong. This has cost, I estimate, between $5 and $10 billion a year since 1992. Right? Almost as much money as like half of the Iraq and Afghanistan war has been spent on this absolutely ridiculous so-called reform of executive pay. $1 trillion is spent every 5 years on corporate tax expenditures. We would like to say that any corporation that receives any corporate tax expenditure, anything, would have to have a broad-based profit sharing, gain sharing, or employee stock ownership plan based on grants. We'd like to see government procurement and tax abatement favoring companies that do this. We'd like to see legislation on state centers, which would encourage the federal government to set up state centers of employee ownership. Chris was the director of the Massachusetts Employee Ownership Center. There are centers now in California, Pennsylvania, Vermont, and we'd like to see state centers all over the country, because where you have these state centers and can educate lawyers and accountants and community college teachers and professors, you see more of these kinds of firms with these ideas developing. Remember, we're not just talking about a worker co-op utopia, we're talking about a set of policies for small business, for tech firms, for stock market companies, for those key 200,000 family-owned businesses between 100 and 500 workers, where the son or daughter is not available to take over the business and it could be sold to an ESOP. So these kinds of ideas. I haven't gotten a chance to talk about this, but I will say that we're spending a lot of time now studying the Alaska Permanent Fund and whether it could be broadened to all 50 states. Because my view is that even if we completely implement all of these capital share policies, the middle class will still be left in a deficit. So we need to move towards dividend funds, not based on a wealth-first approach, but based on financing, right? If we can get money and assets, and this goes to many of Maury's ideas, into these funds, dealing with solar energy farms or wind energy farms and things like this, then hopefully we could develop some interesting dividends. I will end with 1 minute by some forward thinkers on shares. All of these are names of their books. Eric Olin Wright has said, if we have dividend funds and universal basic income, then people are freer to engage in worker cooperatives and worker-owned firms, which don't pay super, super high amounts of wealth shares. Trevor Schultz at the New School has this new book on Ours to Hack and to Own. Melissa Hoover, head of the Democracy at Work Institute, the National Federation of Worker Cooperatives, is doing a national worker co-op survey. My colleague Richard Freeman has just published an article saying that we should own the robots in these dividend funds. It's in Harvard Magazine this month. Maury Cohen has his new book from Oxford coming out on the future of consumer society, where he creates a worker-consumer cooperative for the first time, articulating this new idea. And Maury, I'm happy to tell you that Julia Cagé, in her Harvard University Press book, Saving the Media, has come up with the implementation of your idea for saving newspapers and magazines, essentially a worker-consumer cooperative. She's suggesting a combination of a nonprofit and worker-owned firm. I will end there, and thank you very much for your interest and attention.
Can you send me the list of attendees so I know who are listening? So we have about 40 minutes or so for the discussion. And I'll just open it directly to the floor, questions about methodology as well as substance questions and so on. James.
I have a naive question as someone who's not that familiar with much of what you're talking about. You talk about the 401k as kind of an abhorrent development, and it should be done away with. I guess I'm not. I mean, I realize there can be high risk in the 401k, but not necessarily, depending on the investments, is my understanding anyway. And you paint it with such a broad brush. I wonder if there are any nuances there about less risky types of worker saving investments in such instruments.
Yeah, no, I think there is a big nuance, and I think I didn't communicate accurately. What I'm saying is don't eliminate the 401k, but eliminate the ability for workers to buy their company shares with their savings and their wages in the 401k. I think we should continue to have 401ks. Obviously, most financial advisors want them invested in a diversified portfolio. There is one kind of worker ownership that works in a 401k. It's where companies use shares in the company match. I'm the worker, I put $1 in, the company matches $1 in shares. Those shares are not purchased by me, so I think that they're lower risk. It's workers buying shares in their 401k. So I asked my brother-in-law, who worked for Kimberly-Clark, what do you have in your 401k? Oh, all Kimberly-Clark stock. You don't want that to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested in your thoughts on the changing nature of work and workers in relation to capital shares. So we know that contract labor, part-time labor, Uber-type drivers, the world is changing fast in terms of the traditional relationship between the worker and the enterprise. Is that good news or bad news or no news for the prospects of capital sharing?
It's bad news in the sense that more and more of the productivity in the workforce, and this is no original thought by me, is being represented by capital investment. I mean, look at the small number of Uber headquarter employees that run the whole Uber empire. It's just a few thousand. Look at the small number of Google employees who run the whole internet empire. Twitter, for example. So it's bad news in the sense that that capital is owned and the capital income on that capital is highly concentrated. It's good news in the sense is that to the extent that those are tech companies, many of those tech companies like Google and Twitter, for example, I don't know exactly about Uber, have broad-based employee ownership. Google has broad-based gain sharing, profit sharing, stock options, and employee ownership. I mean, it does everything, all of this stuff. Having said that, the development of part-time workers, the flat and declining middle class wages, the fact that jobs lost in the last recession are replaced by worse jobs, however you want to write in the prediction for technological unemployment, all of this suggests that we will not have a society based on work increasingly in the future. And so I'm expecting that those who will work could have capital shares. Those who won't be needed to work will have to have some kind of a dividend share program like Alaska Universal Basic Income. Maybe at this point, I think Maury's, your idea of consumer worker co-ops becomes really relevant. Eric Olin Wright's notion that if you have a dividend income and you're an artist, maybe you want to basically spend your time on your art, for example, if you have a reasonable dividend income. But it's very clear that a productivist, work-based set of economic and social policies are not the right set of social policies for this future world. But we simply can't have the companies and firms that exist continue to be based on such concentrated ownership and capital income. The corporate form has really failed us. I open chapter 1 of the book, which is the only one I'm recommending that you read, with the debate in the Pennsylvania legislature after the revolution about allowing the first corporate charter in the colonies. And you can read the whole debate. Someone was there. Benjamin Franklin was the governor of Pennsylvania, was presiding at the debate, the unicameral Pennsylvania Assembly. Someone was taking notes. They took 200 pages of notes, what everybody said. And what they said was that the corporation would concentrate on it. I mean, it's turned out exactly as predicted in that debate. I think that the corporation, I know you will be sympathetic to this, is set up at the permission of the Republic. And so I think we've lost that significantly. We have the opposite of that, right? We have $1 trillion in tax expenditures a year. I don't want this idea lost. Hijacked from the Republic by people who want to create the corporation in their own narrow interest. It's not just that we have the corporation, but we have the hijacking of a huge amount of tax expenditures. One of the things I do want to emphasize is if those tax expenditures were used to the benefit of broad-based ownership forms, right? It's not just, oh gee, how could we start more ESOPs? No. The incentives are given to start the opposite of broad-based capital shares. So we have to give the incentives to start capital shares, or if you want to go to an extreme Republican position, which I'm not going to go to, you want to create an even playing field? Okay, let's pull all of GE's tax incentives and deductions and have a real competition.